Hi everyone, and welcome to New Wine United Breaks Out live Q&A session from the mental and emotional health stream. I am Pete and this is Nikki, and we head up Skylark Church in Chelmsford. We also head up Skylark International, which is a network that oversees some churches, some ministries and some charities in the UK and beyond.
Yeah, it's great to be with you. Life in 2020 is fast-paced, it's full of potential, but it's also full of stress and challenges. And it's no wonder against that backdrop, but throwing into the mix a global pandemic, our mental and emotional well-being as a nation is suffering. We are joined by three amazing panelists today, and they are going to do their very best to answer questions that you have submitted, as many as we can possibly cover in the space of the next hour. They each bring a wealth of experience to the conversation. So welcome tonight, Chi-Chi, Kate and Will.
Hi, thanks Pete and Nikki, it's great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to be here with you guys.
So I'd just love it if each of you could just take a moment to introduce yourselves and just to tell us a little bit about your backgrounds.
Sure, who's going to go first? Shall I kick off?
Ladies first, please.
Yeah, okay, ladies first. Hi, so I'm Kate Middleton. I should say I am not married to Prince William, just to clear that up. I am a psychologist and a church leader, and obviously one of the directors of the Mind and Soul Foundation. So working in church in Hertfordshire, but also working as a psychologist, chatting to all sorts of different people in different contexts and spaces. And throughout lockdown, that's really been the story of what I've been doing, except that I have also been homeschooling. So I am, like, my sanity levels have improved a lot since the end of term.
Yes, definitely. That's great.
I'm gonna defer to my elders.
No, come on, Chi-Chi, you're next, buddy.
Hi everyone, I'm Chi-Chi O'Dwyer. I'm a consultant psychiatrist. I work in the NHS and in private practice. I've done a bit of homeschooling. I've also done a bit of bath time today. So that's my contribution.
Hi, and I'm Will van der Hart. I've been a priest, an Anglican priest in London for the last 16 years. And I'm a coach and I'm an author and love communicating around these issues of emotional mental health. And all three of us are co-directors of the Mind and Soul Foundation. And we're just missing Dr. Rob Waller tonight, but it's great to be with you.
It's so great to have you with us.
It really is. And we can tell that we're in for some fun because you guys just get on so well. Okay, we're going to kick off with some general questions, okay, about our mental and emotional health, particularly in the light of COVID lockdown and the easing of lockdown, all of which have really significantly affected our mental health as a nation. So, Kate, we'd love to kick off with you. How do we help people struggling with mental health issues at this time?
Well, it's an interesting question, isn't it? And this is a challenging time. I have a daughter who's 15 and she says it's like the whole world is on one of the psychological experiments that I've told her about. And I think to some degree she's correct. This is a really unusual situation. We're all sick of people saying that, but it is true. And so we talk about people with mental health issues. And the truth is that we all have mental health. We all have emotional health, just like we all have physical health. And in this season, our mental and emotional well-being has been pushed. It's been challenged. We'll probably talk about some of the basic human needs that we've had taken away from us in this time. So I would say almost everyone has mental health issues at this time. We all have to think about how we do this well. Even me as a psychologist, usually I'm speaking into other people's situations. But right now I'm talking about a situation that we're in too. Our family's been pushed to the limit by the experiences of some of what the last 3 months has thrown at us. So I think one of the main things that we can do is create safe spaces to have conversations that are good around mental and emotional health, but also demystifying what is it that's going on? Why are we all reacting like this? Like, why have I suddenly become this crazy cross person? Why am I suddenly so anxious? Why do I feel so overwhelmed that I'm having moments where I just think, I'm not sure I can keep doing this? Because some of what we're dealing with now is inevitable. A lot of what's happening now is outside of our control. That's one of the challenges. But if we don't understand our own human reactions to what's happening, we add some emotions which are within our control, which we don't have to suffer with. And that's fear of our own selves and of the way that we ourselves are reacting. And it's guilt. It's the thing that says, I should be okay. This should be a good time for me. I should be a better parent. I should be able to do this better or differently. And I think the more we can talk, the more we can understand, and the more we can genuinely share what is a challenging and difficult time, the more we can all help each other and genuinely do this together.
Yeah, that's so true, isn't it? And I know that for all of us, when we've been in close quarters with different members of our household, we will have seen that kind of ebb and flow, that rise and fall in our mental and emotional well-being. So, Chi-Chi, just thinking about that, when it comes to our general mental and emotional well-being, what key signs should we be looking out for in those closest to us that might indicate that they're struggling?
I think it's important to appreciate that at the moment, we've all been challenged during this season, and anxiety itself is a normal phenomenon. We, at various times in our life, will all experience anxiety. And I think we'd be hard pressed to find anybody who over the last 4 or 5 months hasn't at some point felt overwhelmed, felt tense or irritable. What we're not saying is that necessarily means you have a diagnosable mental health condition. Now, for some people, maybe those who have an existing mental health diagnosis, it might mean that they're under additional stress, so there's a need to watch out. And for other people who maybe have never had a mental health problem, they may experience that or may have experienced that over this time for the very first time. So there aren't any specific signs, but I think if we look at it on a spectrum, we can think about some concepts. And one concept at one end is what we might call thriving, which is where we really want to be. And things are generally moving in a direction that we're happy with. And at the other end, we might refer to that as languishing. And so when one is thriving, we're thinking very positively about ourselves, the world around us. We're future focused, probably sleeping better, looking outward and helping other people, having regular meals and some structure to our day. Whereas when somebody's languishing, they may have negative cognitions, so those thoughts and feelings about themselves and the world, a ruminative thinking pattern. So that's a really repetitive set of thinking where you just can't get over particular themes, they just keep repeating. Sleeping poorly, being inwardly focused, so self-obsessed, where we talked about regular meals, maybe engaging in comfort eating and not having structure to one's day. So there's not an exhaustive list, but those are just some pointers as to where we may be on the right track and where we may just be in need of a firmer foundation.
Wow, that is incredible. Just listening to that about thriving and languishing, it's this lockdown period for me. I don't think I've ever struggled really with mental health issues until this period of time. And hearing some of those languishing things, wow, I hope that this seminar is going to be so helpful, not just to everybody listening, but to me too. This is really, really important stuff. One of the key areas that would be great to touch on today is anxiety. You've already mentioned it, and we have had so many questions in around this topic. Anxiety is something that everybody experiences at different times in life, but for so many people, their anxiety levels have heightened dramatically during this global pandemic. I'm one of them. So, Will, what advice can you offer that might help people watching today who are suffering with anxiety?
Well, I think 2 things have already been said that are really important. The first one, Kate said, is that we can't control everything, but there's some emotions that we're adding to our circumstance right now, which are detrimental. And Chi-Chi said something else really important, which was actually anxiety is a normal phenomenon. So anxiety in itself isn't a clinical diagnosis. We need to be anxious if we're going to survive. And we all have a limbic system which operates that mechanism within us for anxiety. We have a fight or flight response, which means that in the face of danger, we have physiological and psychological reactions that keep us safe. So one of the first things to say is, it's normal and healthy to be anxious. And actually, this circumstance is hugely threatening, and therefore, as a threat, it will provoke an anxiety response in us. For those of us who I have an actual mental health diagnosis, which is for GAD, generalized anxiety disorder. It feels really interesting having spent a lifetime training for a pandemic in my mind and then actually experiencing a pandemic. So you kind of realize actually I was worrying maybe, and I was learning about how to cope, but not with a pandemic, with my own emotions. And I think that the key thing here is recognizing that acceptance of your experience of anxiety is a really important way of managing your anxiety, but trying to get away from your anxiety all the time is problematic. For Christians, there is particular complexity here. And that is, as Kate said, we can add emotions to emotions that we're already experiencing. And the two emotions that Christians experience when they have anxiety is, firstly, guilt, is that I shouldn't feel anxious. And secondly, shame, that maybe my anxiety is a sign of my sin and therefore that I'm somehow disobeying God. And that's normally because priests like me often teach the instruction, do not worry or do not be anxious, like the 11th commandment. But actually, we tend to butcher scripture. And actually, it was never an 11th commandment. The two key passages around anxiety are the Matthew 6:34, do not be anxious about tomorrow, do not worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow will take care of itself. Today has enough problems of its own. The caveat, the second clause, is the most important one. What Jesus is actually doing is using a very helpful piece of cognitive behavioral therapy to help us stop catastrophizing, which is actually imagining the future and trying to resolve tomorrow's problems with today's strengths, which is impossible. So Jesus is not saying don't worry about today. He's saying actually attend to the cares of today, but don't actually put your energies into trying to sort out tomorrow. So not catastrophizing is one of the first things we can decide for. When Paul says in Philippians, do not be anxious about anything, in 4:6, everyone also goes, oh my goodness, I'm terribly anxious, that must be a sin. He actually doesn't leave us in that position. He says three things we can do in everything: by prayer, petition, and thanksgiving, bring our requests for God. And actually what that process does, firstly, prayer helps to crystallize our actual anxieties and make clear what we are concerned about. Petition helps us to actually take action in the face of those anxieties and ask for help, which is something we all need to do. And being thankful is actually gratitude training, which helps to augment our experience of anxiety and focus on some of the positive things in our life, which is also brilliant. So here are two passages in Scripture which are often used in a way to make people feel ashamed and guilty, which actually bring us life and freedom. The key thing about dealing with anxiety in lockdown is not adding emotions to the emotions we're already experiencing, as Kate said. If we can say, I do feel anxious and this is uncomfortable, but I don't need to feel ashamed or guilty, then actually we can just experience the fear bit without all of the associated compounding emotions. And I like to help people to experience anxiety for as long as it's there and let it fade on its own. Sometimes we need to get further help, but quite often we can get out of the anxiety spiral by not fueling the fire, by adding emotions to this already painful experience.
Yeah, that's so true. And I definitely know, just from being a church leader, how much people do struggle with the guilt and shame that you spoke about, attached to some of the way that the Bible has been unpacked and explained. And it's so important, isn't it, to release people from that. One of the things that I've noticed, just being a mum at the school gate and having conversations with other parents, is that this pandemic has massively affected our children's anxiety levels as well. And Kate, I was just wondering, you're a parent yourself. How would you navigate that with your children? And what advice could you offer to any parents who are worried about their children and their anxiety levels at the moment?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, yes, by the way, it's much easier being the psychologist than the parent. I think that's the harder job, being the parent. So well done to all you parents out there. Parenting through a pandemic is a kind of an interesting experience, right? And I think the key, like Will has said with anxiety, is to realise that it is going to happen. I mean, anxiety, a model that I use with adults and with children, is to say it's a bit like a smoke alarm. It goes off to warn you that something significant might be going on. Something in your environment could be risky, could be important. You might need to do something. And, you know, right now there are triggers and cues all around us all the time that aren't normal, they're not right. And so we will all experience these spikes of anxiety, and so will our children. You know, you're walking down the street, you see someone with a face mask on. Until our brains get used to that, every time that happens, we're going to experience a spike of anxiety as your brain says, look at that. Is that something you need to do something with? So I talk about acing anxiety, ACE, and the first one, A, is to anticipate anxiety, to expect it. We know it's going to be around. So we need to talk to our children about that. And as parents, I think we're often scared ourselves that if when our children come to us and they're anxious, that if we talk to them about that anxiety, maybe we'll make it worse. That maybe somehow by focusing on it, we'll blow it up or make it a bigger deal. Our instinct is very often to sort of push it away, la, 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 oh, look at that, anything other than talk about this anxious moment that your child's having. But actually to say to them, do you know what? One of the challenges of this season is that we're all going to experience a bit of anxiety. And let's talk about that. What are your worries? What are you anxious about? And sometimes they have some good questions that we hopefully can answer, maybe not immediately. My son is 8. He's had some very good questions, especially some theological ones about what on earth is God doing and why doesn't he sort this all out? That was quite tricky to answer in the moment. But we can create those spaces where our kids can talk and share. And what happens then is that what we're saying to them is this anxiety isn't a fearful thing. It's okay. We all have it. And one of our jobs as parents is to do that for our kids' emotions, to validate them, to help them name them, to help them understand what this weird, horrible feeling is, and to help them hold them confidently. So ACE, A is anticipate, expect it, talk to your kids about it. C is to challenge it. Now, what I mean there is with anxiety, the worst thing with anxiety is when you feel at the mercy of it. You feel there's nothing you can do. It's out of your control. You're just like this little boat on the ocean and there's waves hitting you. You're totally at the mercy of the crazy world around you. We want to teach our kids, actually, you can take control of this. So let's say there's something they're really anxious about. For example, something all of us parents will have to deal with in September is our kids going back to school. Some of them have had some time in school. My kids largely haven't. My son hasn't been in school. It'll be over 6 months by the time he goes back. Now, a lot of children are going to find those first few days anxiety provoking. So we talk about that and we say, let's challenge that. That first day, the first experience of going to school, are there some bits of that we can do earlier? Maybe we can walk past your school. Some kids haven't seen their school in months. Maybe we can stand at the railings. Maybe we can chat about what's it going to be like to go back that day. As we get closer, maybe there's some other things and we can say, let's do this, and talk to them while we're stood outside the school gate practicing. We can say, like, are you feeling anxious now? That's okay. Here's some things we can do. Let's chat about something else. I love with kids, I love counting the sounds they can hear. Something that takes their attention off themselves and their anxiety and grounds them back in the real world. So that's a really good one to do with kids. But just waiting, and generally if you wait when you're in an anxiety peak, it will gradually drop back down. And what you're teaching them then is how to hold their anxiety well, how to control it, but also how not to fear it. So the E is then you edge forward. And the key with anxiety is to try and avoid a situation where your kids are suddenly thrown in the deep end and they have to face the thing they're most terrified of. So if you can gradually edge forward, break up the biggie into some little steps and help them build their confidence about challenging their anxiety, it will really help. But also just not being afraid to have the conversations, which I think is the hardest thing. And to be honest with you, I think as a parent, the biggest issue for me in supporting my kids with their anxiety is my anxiety. So sometimes what I need to do is look after myself, get some sleep, get some time out, have some good conversations myself, because then I'm in a much better position to support my kids really well.
That is a fantastic answer. Thank you, Kate. I love that ACE thing. And once again, the conversations are so important at this time, aren't they? So many people are more anxious than ever as a result of COVID. How do we support our friends and colleagues as they battle huge anxieties over what the future holds? Chi-Chi, can I ask you that one?
Thanks, Pete. It's a really tricky question. And I'd probably pick up on that theme of conversations. What I would throw into that is not trying to necessarily fix the problem. I think we've identified the fact that the range of things that people are anxious about is endless, and the severity of the anxiety can vary massively. So we have identified that there may be instances where we can challenge people, and actually one is able to effectively nip it in the bud. But there may be situations, and we know at this time that might range from someone losing their job, to bereavement, to getting ill oneself. So issues that as an individual, as a loved one or a colleague, there's a limit to what you can do. But what you can do is have the conversation. And in that conversation, I'd encourage people to actually identify what is making someone anxious. Because we can make assumptions and we head down a completely unhelpful track. So we've touched on some of these. It might be the virus itself that people are worried about, school, the fact that you're holed up with your spouse and your kids, and you're getting cabin fever, all of those challenges, worries about your work. And the actual intervention you need is going to vary massively if you've had a bereavement versus if you're worried about your job the next day. So sitting down and listening and finding out what people are worried about. I think the things to look out for is when we're talking about anxiety, it's usually one of two things. And it's that the individual might be worried about the challenge being overwhelming, or their ability to overcome whatever the challenge is to be diminished. So they underestimate their capacity to deal with it, or they just find that they don't think that they can deal with the matter at hand. So as a friend or family member, you're not necessarily going to come up with the answer, but what you can do is to point them in the right direction. And I think in addition to giving them words of encouragement, pushing them towards getting help, and that is going to depend on what the actual anxiety-provoking situation is. So it might be something that can be dealt with within an informal network of friends or parents, as Kate alluded to. Or if you've got a particular worry in your workplace, there may be someone within your work setting, and maybe you've got a work WhatsApp group that can support you. Thinking about a church context, it might be members of your Bible study group. And then there's another level where you may seek professional help, and that's going to your GP or your psychological therapy service. So it really depends on what arises and that ability to just discern what's really happening for the individual.
Thank you, Chi-Chi. That is a really helpful answer, and particularly just to hear about the sort of different sources of help that are available, because I think sometimes that can feel like a bit of a minefield in itself. So that's really useful. And I know that we'll have some more resources for people to access at the end of this conversation that might be just useful signposts in that scenario. One of the things that we have said, and I'm sure it's not a term that's exclusive to our church, but it feels like we're on this massive corona coaster at the moment where our emotions are just all over the place. You can have these sudden spikes of mountaintop moments, and then the next moment just feel like you are feeling so low. And when it comes to thinking about emotions, I suppose sometimes in church we spend a lot of time telling people not to solely rely on their feelings, and I understand why we say that, because sometimes our feelings can lead us down an unhelpful path, but at the same time we have to be listening to our emotions. We have to be acknowledging what's taking place inside of us. So Will, how can we best manage our emotions when we're dealing with situations that perhaps make us feel anxious? Oh, we've just lost your sound for a moment there.
I've got muted, sorry. So I slightly react to the idea of emotional management. I know in psychological terms, we often talk about managing emotions well, but what I tend to find in Christian context is it's not about management, it's about control. So in Christian settings, what I see is that people desperately try and control their emotions. And they're doing that with a good heart, because they're saying, oh, I don't want to be controlled by my emotions. But actually, our emotions are relatively benign. They're a reaction to our circumstances and experiences. And God's actually coded in all these emotions. So, in the Christian church, it can feel like there are two sort of speeds. You're allowed to be happy and joyful, but pretty much everything else is prohibited. But if you look at Jesus, Jesus is actually the most emotionally complete person that the world has ever seen. So yes, he's filled with joy, but he's also filled with sorrow. Yes, he's filled with assurance, but also he's so anguished that he's sweating drops of blood. He's so angry that he binds a cord together and whips out the men in the temple courts who are trading there. Jesus' emotions are pretty extreme and they're pretty complete. And I think what I would like to see in the church setting is people trying less hard to control their emotions and being more curious about the emotions that they're experiencing. We advocate things like just using the emoji screen on your phone to try an emotional descriptive exercise where every day you in your notes page write down, or you choose 5 emojis that really reflect the emotions of your day. Now, it sounds like a simple thing, but actually in the church context, it's really helpful because there are so many different emojis that can reflect our different emotions. And I think, emotional repression is really damaging, where people try and push down what they're really feeling. Thought suppression nearly always only results in those thoughts being reflexively stronger and therefore more overwhelming. And as an organization, what we want to see is Christians becoming more confident at handling the emotions that they're having, rather than repressing, suppressing, or denying the emotions that they're having, which seems to be altogether more common. As far as anxiety is concerned, I found personally a tool, it's called E&RP, exposure and response prevention, the best possible mode of treatment for me with my own mental health. And that tool is as simple as it sounds. It's experiencing something that's anxiety provoking and then refusing to respond in a controlling manner by escaping the circumstance. We would say something like, feel the fear and do it anyway. And increasingly, as we expose ourselves to things that make us feel uncomfortable and anxious, we habituate that fear, and therefore we're able to get on with our lives. The thing about fear is it's not benign. It constantly steals ground. So if you started off feeling like the hypermarket was pretty scary, you might leave the hypermarket and go to the supermarket and think, oh, now I'm fine. But after a while, you find the supermarket scary, and then you go to the local store and you think, now I'm fine. And then you find that frightening. And then you go home, become agoraphobic, and order from Ocado. The fact is that anxiety steals your ground, and it doesn't have a place at which it stops and says, I've had enough. It keeps chewing away at you. And that's why feeling the fear and doing it anyway is so important. It's also why exposure and response prevention is so important. And techniques like mindfulness, which can help you be aware of your anxiety, but carry on like attending to the issues of the day, will actually assist you to live really well. Jesus teaches about this in watchfulness. The virgins didn't just spend their time attending to the lamps. They obviously attended to all the needs of the house, but they kept the lamps lit all the time. And watchfulness is really a great example of Christian mindfulness. I can be anxious and have the lamp of anxiety lit, but I can actually attend to all of the sort of issues that my day needs, and all my family and my spouse and my church, and do those things despite the flame of anxiety being alight in me. So for me, it's not about controlling emotions or overly managing emotions. It's about experiencing emotions and befriending them and becoming more confident with the way in which we experience them.
Thank you for that answer, Will. That is an amazing answer. And I love the fact that feel the fear and do it anyway is what you have to do when you lead a church quite often. And it's also, really going to be useful to people listening today, because we need to learn to manage it, as you say, not control it. It's fantastic. Okay, we'd like to switch away from anxiety now to the new normal, that phrase we've heard so much. Lockdown is now easing, but the world that we're navigating is far from life as we knew it, with so much overarching uncertainty and so much fear in many quarters surrounding the future. So here's a question for each of you, okay? With the wealth of experience and knowledge that each of you three bring to the table, what would be your top tip for coming out of lockdown and entering the new normal?
Okay, shall I kick off again? Should we go with our usual order? Because that's easy, isn't it? So I think my top tip is actually something that we can all do now, but it's going to be quite tricky. We're going to have to be quite intentional about it. And it is this: stop. Just for a minute, stop. Get some rest, get some time out. I'm speaking to so many people right now who are actually finding this season of trying to go back to a new normal almost harder than lockdown was, because lockdown was difficult, but it had a lot of clarity. There was more shared experience. We were all in the same boat. This season now is hard. It's exhausting. There's risk, there's uncertainty, there's disagreement, debate. Even the media can't decide, are we doomed or is it going to be normal by Christmas? And we are all exhausted because we're coming at this after 3 months of lockdown, of things being difficult anyway. And the problem with that is that these emotions we've been talking about, particularly anxiety and also, oh my goodness, frustration and anger. I don't know if anybody else, I have never been so crabby in my whole life. My poor family. I asked my son, what has he learned out of a term of homeschooling? And he thought for a while and said, before you start maths class, always make sure your teacher's had a cup of coffee. Genuine story. That's how crabby I've been. But the problem is, so these emotions, they're on the same physiological system as our stress system, the system that controls just how your body and your brain react to whatever's going on around you. So it might be stuff that's distressing, but it doesn't have to be distressing to be stressful. And just all the change, all the juggling, all the unusualness, all of us we're close to our overwhelm point already. And it's a bit, if you think of it like the water in a pool, it's like the water's already at your neck. And then the little waves of everyday life that normally you would handle fine suddenly become major problems. And you feel like literally I might go under. I mean, like, why would you stack the dishwasher wrong now? I mean, are you trying to push me over an edge? It's things like that normally we would control, we tolerate really well. And I could joke about it, but that might be that, or it might be that phone call from work. Or the thought of going back to work. I'm having so many conversations with people who are just saying, I don't think I can go back to the office. I don't think I can do this. I don't have it within me. And you know what? We can panic and we can think, what's happened to me? Or we can recognize the truth. We are shattered. And we could spend the next month over the summer through August, worrying about what's coming in September, still antsy, still busy, or we could do what we need to do to take some rest. And I know that's not easy. I'm a psychologist. I've never been so busy in my entire life. But if I don't rest now, I won't have what I need to have in the tank come September. So that's my tip as we go into the new normal. What do you need to do to find some time out? Is it a day? Is it a weekend? Is it going away? Is it taking some holiday, even when you feel like maybe you shouldn't? Get out of your house, do something different, get away.
I'm going to go next, and I'm going to cheat and give 2 responses because one thing I've learned during this season is you get some surprises and you need to roll with the punches. So the reason I muted myself when I was moving around is there was a knocking on the door and I've got company just before bedtime. Off you go. So that's my first one, is just go with it. We are all in it together and things aren't going to be perfect. In my work, occasionally I get intruders and my very graceful patients quite like the sound of babies banging on the doors and screaming. So have a bit of fun with it. But the second thing, on a more serious note, is thinking about your energy, your sources of energy. One of the things I've loved doing in this season is listening to some really interesting podcasts from a very wide range of sources. One of the regulars is Craig Groeschel, the American pastor. And a podcast I listen to, he's from Life Church in the US. He talked about different sources of energy and he broke it down into physical energy, so sleep, nutrition, exercise, creative energy. So things like listening to podcasts, going on webinars, volunteering. Remember I talked about being outward focused and not too insular. Emotional connectivity and energy. So that's having those conversations with loved ones and having the lightness as well to those conversations, because it certainly was very serious. Remember the start of lockdown and how intense that period was. And finally, of course, spiritual energy, and just finding ways spiritually to rejuvenate oneself, to reconnect. And that might be through meditative prayer, through connecting with members of your church community. And that's been a great challenge. So we've talked about all the things that we're missing out on and the challenges, but what a massive opportunity that's been, rather than rushing out of the church doors at 2 minutes past the hour when the service ends, and actually getting to know each other in small groups online without much of a rush, because we've got nowhere else to go.
Yeah.
That's me.
So true. Will, how about you?
So my one is about really falling back in love with uncertainty. And, I think, in many ways, I know it sounds strange to say, but our world has never been safer historically than it is right now. And yet it feels more dangerous than it's ever felt. And, through the device that we are using to record this webinar, we can work out the temperature of the North Pole in a couple of clicks. We can find out, what's going on in the Sahara Desert, and we can predict pretty much everything. And I think 21st century living has been really earmarked by this addiction that we have to knowledge. Like, I need to know everything in order that I can stay safe. And in previous centuries, there have been pandemics, there have been plagues, there have been raiding hordes from Scandinavia appearing suddenly on the Northumberland coast, stealing away your livelihood in a moment. But the difference is that no one could predict it because no one knew it was going to come. And I think we are living in a world which is so addicted to certainty that we've lost sight of the beauty of living in the moment. And actually, as Christians, we are people who have a certain future, but we live in an uncertain world. And what it means to live well, I think, in the 21st century is foregoing our love of certainty in the now for the certainty that we have in Christ's death, resurrection, and his return in glory. And it's a discipline for me, because honestly, I would search everything out on Google to make sure everything was going to be okay. But ultimately, I have to choose, no matter how I love reassurance. Everyone who has an anxiety problem loves reassurance. We love to use our spouses to say, do you think it's going to be okay? They say yes. We're like, oh yes, brilliant, amazing. We're not sure. You wake up in the night with a headache. You go on Google, you find out you might have the bubonic plague, and then you're reassured suddenly that it's just a headache and you're dehydrated. You have a glass of water to go back to sleep. Oh, great, it's okay. I'm going to be okay. We have this strange addiction to being reassured, and we love to know the answer to every question. And I think it's a bad way of living, if I'm honest. I think it steals a lot of joy from just being present right now with all of the uncertainty, but all of the joy in the immediacy. And it steals something from our amazing faith to know actually that it's not me that controls the future, it's God. And I'm ultimately in the palm of his hands. And I do think that this area of certainty and uncertainty is an area that we can either give in to the temptation of always wanting to be reassured, or we can actually choose to live with uncertainty and greater confidence. It's not an emotion, it's just a decision. And I know I have to practice that decision every day. So actually, I'm going to live with that reassurance. I'm just going to pray it's going to be okay, but I'm not going to try and reassure myself that it's going to be okay. And that discipline, I think, has helped me, and I think it could help others to live more freely, because they're not constantly searching for answers to questions that actually shouldn't really even be asked.
That is so helpful, and it really resonates with me, because what we've kind of found is we've navigated our way and are trying to carry people in our church through this time is that generally we tend to fall into two camps. There's a whole heap of people that just want to go back to the way things were, and so are looking over their shoulder and just wishing everything is as it was beforehand, which occasionally I feel like too, if I'm honest. But then there's like another camp of people who want to name the new thing before it's here. It's like, I just have to find a framework that I can put this in so that I understand how to live in this space of uncertainty. So we're definitely really uncomfortable with that uncertain space. And I guess that leads me into our next question, which I'm actually going to read because it's a really long question, but the person who submitted this question, I think, has beautifully encapsulated what so many of us are feeling at the moment about this new normal, about the fact that, you know, so much seems to have changed, but we still can't really tell what's around the corner. So I'm going to read this, and the question, I'll start with you, Kate, but of course, if anyone else wants to jump in and answer this too, they can. So here we go. It says this: everything seems to be starting to return to normal, with shops opening and people booking holidays, but I'm scared to go back out into the world as it was. I was on the vulnerable list, and I'm still scared about catching the virus and becoming ill or worse. My friends, family and work colleagues seem to be excited that lockdown is over, but I feel far from okay. I don't want to have to go back to the office or out to the shops. Is this me being faithless? Is there something wrong with me because I seem to be so out of step with everyone else? What a great question.
That's so beautifully put. And there will be so many people hearing that who are saying, oh, that's me too. So thank you to the person who asked that, just for expressing it so well. And you've heard me say already, we know that one of the things that helps people in emergency situations is that sense of shared experience. And one of the challenges throughout lockdown has always been difference. There have always been differences, and they have always been challenging. So the difference between someone who's furloughed and has spent 3 months basically lying in the sun or doing their gardening, and someone who's been frontline or flat out working, homeschooling, or worrying about how they're going to put food on the table because they've been made redundant, or things. These differences have always been present, and they've always been difficult. They've always caused distress. And what we're seeing now in this phase, as some people are able to go back to something sort of resembling normal, is that some of those differences have become more visible, more felt. And so I would say one of the big ones is for the people who are currently still shielding. So we're filming this right at the end of July. So we're right on the cusp. The 1st of August is when that's going to officially cease. But all the people I'm speaking to are saying, well, what does that mean? Because the risk is still there. How do I respond? So what I want to say is, no, you're not being faithless. Such a theme that we've talked about already. This is your brain's natural response to a situation. It's warning you something's going on here. You need to figure it out, take some time to ponder. What I would say to people in this situation is, it's worth helping yourself to do whatever you need to do to make a good decision around some of your risk and what you're prepared to do, what you're not prepared to do, what you should do, what you shouldn't do. And those two things may or may not match, because it may be that some people say, well, you can do this, and you think, do you know what, I don't want to. And those decisions are about risk and they're about value. So something might be very risky but very valuable, so you think, actually that feels worth it, like hugging my grandchild may in theory be something that's risky, but you know what, it's totally, I'm going to do that. Whereas going to the supermarket, hey, I could just order from Ocado, that's not such a big deal. You know, we can make those sorts of decisions, but you do need to know something about how big your risk is, and most people I'm speaking to are struggling with that. So I would advise you to speak to your healthcare professional, whether it's your GP, whether it's a consultant. Try and find someone who can give you a genuine sense of how big your risk really is. Most doctors now are getting, we understand a lot more now than we did 3 months ago about who is at the biggest risk from this. And it may be that then you can start to make some decisions. And I know some people who've been told, actually, shielding may be over, you should probably continue to shield. I know some people who've been told that. I know others where people have said, you know what, if you feel comfortable to go and do things as anybody else would. So try and get that sense, and then try and make some decisions. And once you've drawn some lines, then you can have some conversations. So obviously the work one is really tricky, but I would encourage people to talk to your employer, talk to HR, talk to whoever it is you need to talk to, and do that as soon as possible. Don't worry about it until the moment you're supposed to go back into work and then just think, I can't do it. Get in touch with them, have a conversation, and then you can think about ways that you can return to work whilst also holding your vulnerability as well. Issues around school, kids going back to school, again, talk to the school. It may well be that you can get some reassurance. I know so many families who are incredibly anxious about the return to school because it's compulsory, and yet they feel like there are people in that household who are very vulnerable, and the kids going back to school might bring the virus home. This is really emotionally brutal. It's hard. So have some conversations with school, talk about what the options are. So I think definitely not something wrong with you. And I don't think you're as out of step as you realise. I think the difficulty in all of this is about who has the opportunity to articulate, to talk, who's got the microphone, who is it on social media who's making all the noise. And quite often it's been the people in the better situations, because they have the time to go on social media and be chatty. But also, like Chi-Chi says, if you're struggling, the last thing you feel like doing is going and putting a beautiful Instagram post of yourself or going on Facebook. So inevitably what we do is we vocalize the people who are in a better situation, and then the people who are struggling feel like, well, maybe it's just me. But it isn't just you, so be encouraged by that.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you for that answer. You know, we're going to move on a couple of questions down and look at the topic of isolation and loneliness now. And it's interesting, Kate, that you just said that when people are struggling, they don't want to be putting themselves out there. And that's really summed up in this first question. So, Chi-Chi, we'd like to put this to you. How can we overcome deep-seated loneliness? Why is it that loneliness stops us from reaching out? You'd think that the opposite would be true.
Yeah, loneliness has become a topic of great interest, even pre-COVID-19. And just thinking about the effect it can have on our physical and psychological well-being. We're still really just unpicking that, but it seems to be a factor that has potentially significant implications for our long-term well-being. It's been exacerbated during this time because things that we could just take for granted and ways in which we can operate have been massively disrupted. So I approach this question with real sensitivity because it's easy for us. You know, we can fall into the danger. I've done it myself. You know, we make references to our families and our children, and we must have sympathy for those who are not in that position and feel really disconnected from other people. I wouldn't want to give a sort of one-size-fits-all answer, because some people are quite happy doing their own thing, and they will find groups that they naturally connect with, but actually the vast bulk of the time they may want to be on their own. And I think one of the helpful things when we're thinking about overcoming loneliness is not automatically to assume that the answer is other people. It may be other things. I talked about the importance of prayer as a sort of spiritual form of energy. And that might be something that on an individual basis, one seeks to engage in overcoming loneliness. And of course, prayer can be more of a corporate exercise. And that would link me into the importance of what the church community can bring in having groups. And one of the great things is that church is a place that we can come together as single people, as couples, as parents, as young, as old. And it's great to have that time to share a range of experiences, including the difficulties that we have, and also to pray together. So I think that would be right at the top of my list. But it is really important to understand on an individual basis what are the things and the people that you connect to. So it may be colleagues, might be family members, friends, neighbours. And I would just go back to that very early part of lockdown. There was that real sense of unity, and when walking down the street was a big deal, and that was about the only time we were leaving our homes. That ability to maybe speak to a neighbour that we'd never spoken to before, we didn't know their names, popping notes through our neighbours' doors and finding out how people are doing. So I think it's a two-way thing. Sometimes we have to be bold and put ourselves out there a bit. And other times it's seeking out those who we feel may be lonely. So there's a big responsibility that we have as members of a community.
Thank you. That was such a rich answer. And thinking about those little community moments that we had at the beginning of lockdown, I just remember the first time we all stood on our doorstep and clapped for the NHS, and I cried because I felt so connected to my neighbours at a time where we'd all just been forcibly in our homes, and there was something so moving about that moment of connection. We're going to finish on this last question, so perhaps Will and Kate, you just both like to give a little brief answer to this one. But we had a question in from a church leader saying that isolation has been a significant concern within their church, and something that we know is probably of equal concern to a lot of churches, because although we do have all of this beautiful connectivity via Zoom and other technology, sometimes that only seems to enhance the chasm between us. It's not the same as that face-to-face connection. Is there anything that we've learned through supporting people's mental and emotional well-being remotely during this period of time that we could apply longer term, especially if we were to enter lockdown again?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a single answer to that question, but I do think that, you know, approaching it from a really layered perspective is so important, and actually dissecting congregations into smaller groups, as Chiti's mentioned, home groups, being able to peer support one another, you know, it's been foundational to people's well-being. It turns out that actually telephone calls are far better for empathetic connection than Zoom calls are. So if you're going to smell the roses, you tend to close your eyes because you get a deeper sensory experience just through smell. If you're going to hug someone, you tend to close your eyes because you have a deeper sensory experience through that kinesthetic engagement. And actually, when you add visual to audio call, you lose empathetic connection. You don't increase it. And so one of the things you can do is just to make a regular phone call is actually more meaningful than actually doing a face call. And Zoom, people have talked about being zoomed out. And as you say, feeling a deeper disconnection from others. It's partly because the medium doesn't really help us. It's brilliant at information transmission, but it's not brilliant at actually helping us feel connected. Nothing's a substitute for being in the room with another person, in my view, as a church leader. But you know, I think one of the foundational things about overcoming isolation in lockdown has been that we connect over our vulnerabilities, not over our strengths. And it's really disappointing when church leaders particularly exacerbate a kind of gung-ho, super strong, wow, Christus Victor, let's not be worried about this, sort of, God's overcome, because ultimately people are sitting at home thinking, I feel terrible, I'm absolutely terrified, and you've got it all sorted. Whereas when leaders have been able to share their vulnerabilities, their congregations have felt more connected and also more comforted. So I think it's been a really important thing about genuine honesty. And there isn't any bravado in lockdown in real terms. Like all of the glitz is kind of gone. And I think leaders who've been quite raw, their congregations have just done better, because it's like, yeah, we're all in this, Rick Warren said, we're all in the same storm, we're just not all in the same boat. And I think people have needed to actually articulate that, empathize with one another, particularly to people who are in a much smaller boat or maybe on a life raft, and get away from this idea that we're all somehow in some RNLI super ship and that no one's actually experiencing any real risk here. So if we're going to go through this again, we've got to go through it more vulnerably. And I think for me, as an emotional health specialist anyway, getting to the place of vulnerability earlier and actually having the real conversations earlier would have been good news. I mean, we would all have said it would have been better to have locked down a few weeks earlier. I would say, yeah, that's definitely true. And by the same token, it would have been much better to be really vulnerable about our circumstances quite a lot earlier. And I think the reality is that now I think people are connecting much more honestly, but it's taken time. It might be, a cultural thing for us here not to talk about things we're truly afraid of. But I think vulnerability connects us, and ultimately it connects us in confidence to God and his awesome power. But the fact that he was incarnate has made lockdown much more palatable, because he became flesh and moved into our neighborhood. He kind of knows what this experience looks like. And it's the difference, I think, in leaders leading incarnationally versus leading from a distance. They're the bridges that we have to overcome to help people feel connected.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's such a good answer. I mean, I would just add to that. I think we have learned some things about ourselves, a lot of us, and about other people. I think this time we made assumptions about who would find this easy and who wouldn't. And I think we have all learned some things about ourselves and about how we work that might change the way that we do things next time. So like I'm a massive introvert. Everybody thought that introverts would love lockdown, but like, hello, there's people in all my spaces. And actually I hate Zoom so much more than my very extrovert husband, who chats away on Zoom just with the greatest of ease. I absolutely hate it, and the dissonance of it, and I'm terrible at phone calls. So what I found myself doing, which I wouldn't do again, is I became very all or nothing. I just thought, well, if I can't see someone face to face, I just can't do it. I'm just not going to do it. I'll just basically talk to no one outside of work for 3 months. That actually doesn't work. It wasn't a great strategy. So I think we've learned things about ourselves that hopefully would equip us better the second time. But the other thing I would say is that we've learned as well that, do you know what? Lockdown, not a competition. Like Will says, when we went into it this time, there was all this stuff about how are you going to win at lockdown? What are you going to achieve? And it turns out just getting through it is actually a really good achievement. And I hope that if we went into another one, there would be, like Will says, more compassion, more support, less of our trying to take our sort of normal culture of striving and achieving, and that's where we get our value from, into this weird and wonderful season, and saying, actually, do you know what? I'm worth everything just for being who I am. I don't need to do this really well, just getting through, just surviving, caring for one another well, being kind to ourselves, being kind to other people.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, guys, for those answers.
Amazing.
Well, that already is the end of this incredible time together. Thank you very much for being with us. Nikki's going to see us out in a moment, but before then, I'm going to close in prayer. So, Father, we come to you in the name of Jesus. We thank you that you love us just the way we are, that you have great plans for us. You have hopes and dreams for us. You hold us in your hands. There is no place we would rather be. Lord, thank you that you let us know it's okay to not be okay. Lord, I thank you that you are Emmanuel, God with us, in the highs and in the lows. You never leave us. You never forsake us. You never will. You are such a good God. And Lord, I pray for everyone who has been watching this webinar, Lord, that you would work in their hearts. You would show them your love and your peace. And they would be able to just move into this new normal, putting one foot in front of the other, being kind to themselves, and doing life knowing that there are people around them and a God who loves them. Amen.
Amen. Well, I just want to say a huge thank you to Chi, Kate and Will for sharing so much knowledge, insight, practical keys for us. And don't forget that as part of our stream tomorrow, there will be a fantastic second seminar. We're looking forward to hearing from the lovely Kate Middleton, and she'll be sharing so much more. So do tap into that. And of course, we have Patrick Regan on our third day as well. So it's going to be amazing. Thank you for sharing this moment with us. And we will be posting up resources that you can access to help signpost you. So if you've been struggling with anything that we have touched on, hopefully there will be some resources available that will be of use to you. Thank you so much, and goodbye.
Take care.